He dismissed the opportunity without a second thought, never knowing who he'd just offended. When he realized the truth, he hadn't just insulted a client, but someone who could ruin his career. His heart stopped. What happened next changed everything. But let's start at the beginning. It was just another slow morning at Bridges Auto Mall, a mid-sized dealership tucked away in downtown Philadelphia. The glossy new cars sat perfectly aligned, gleaming under the showroom lights. But the usual hustle and bustle felt distant. Inside, it was eerily quiet. Greg Daniels, a middle-aged sales associate, leaned back in his chair, flipping through a magazine with little interest. The clock ticked slowly, marking the moments that dragged on. Greg's routine was predictable, until the door chimed. A man stepped in, sharply dressed in a suit that seemed too expensive for a place like this. His presence was calm, yet there was something about him that immediately caught Greg's attention. The man approached the nearest desk with confidence, but not arrogance. His smile was polite, but there was a coolness to it. Greg didn't even look up from his magazine as he muttered, almost out of habit, "Can I help you?" The man, with unhurried poise, answered, "Yes, I'm interested in the new Lexus. I'd like to take a look at the features." Greg's eyes flickered briefly in the man's direction, but he wasn't impressed. The man looked composed, almost too composed. Something about his quiet demeanor rubbed Greg the wrong way. He didn't seem like the type of person who would even consider buying a luxury car. A part of Greg scoffed at the idea. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. This wasn't going to be a serious sale. Without raising his eyes, Greg gave a flat response. "Sorry, but I don't think we have the right car for you. Maybe you should check out the used cars," he said, his tone dismissive and almost bored. For a brief moment, the man paused. There was no flash of anger or irritation on his face. Instead, his expression betrayed only mild surprise, as though he hadn't expected this kind of response. He didn't argue, though. He simply nodded, then turned and left without another word. Greg watched him walk out, a small smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "Good riddance," he thought to himself, pleased with his quick judgment. He returned to his magazine, his sense of superiority momentarily restored. The dealership went quiet again, but this time, there was a faint unease that lingered in the air. Greg couldn't shake the thought that something about the man wasn't quite as it seemed, but he quickly brushed it off. Another slow Tuesday, after all. The rest of the morning passed in a haze for Greg. He moved through his usual routine, taking calls, answering emails, trying to keep busy, but his mind kept drifting back to that brief exchange with Charles. It gnawed at him, that feeling of having misjudged someone. He couldn't shake the nagging thought that he had made a mistake. But why? Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was in a bad mood, Greg muttered to himself, his eyes vacant as he stared down at the phone in his hand. He hoped that a call would come in to distract him, anything to avoid dwelling on it. The minutes stretched on, each second dragging heavier than the last. Then, an hour later, the phone rang. Greg didn't recognize the number, but his manager's name flashed on the screen. Mitch. Greg sighed, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "Greg, we've just received an important customer." Mitch's voice cut through the tension. "His name's Charles Williams, and he's here to finalize a deal. He's looking to buy that Lexus. Make sure you don't make the same mistake again." Greg's stomach plummeted. Charles Williams, the same man he had dismissed so callously. His pulse quickened as his mind scrambled to piece together the consequences of his actions. What had he done? His body tensed, ready to stand up, to make things right, but his legs felt like lead. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt as the realization hit him like a freight train. "By the way," Mitch continued, the words landing like ice-cold water, "Charles Williams is the CEO of Williams Motors, The guy who's been eyeing our dealership for a potential merger. Greg's heart slammed against his chest. The weight of his mistake came crashing down on him all at once. He had no idea who he'd just insulted. He had dismissed a powerful man, someone who could have been crucial to the future of the dealership, someone whose decision now hung in the balance. A wave of panic washed over Greg, and he quickly stood, his hands trembling slightly. The world around him seemed to slow, his thoughts spiraling. How could he have been so blind, so careless? What had seemed like a mundane interaction now felt like a turning point, one that could change everything. But it was too late for apologies now. Greg rushed to the showroom floor, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of guilt and anxiety. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker as he spotted Charles standing in front of the Lexus, inspecting it with an intensity that made Greg feel smaller with each step. The luxury car, once just another model on the floor, now seemed like the backdrop for his own humiliating mistake. He approached hesitantly, his mouth dry. The words he needed to say felt trapped in his throat. "Mr. Williams, Greg stammered, unable to form a coherent apology. But Charles, without even looking at him, raised a hand. "I know what you're going to say," he said, his tone calm, measured. "But it doesn't matter. Let's talk about the car." Greg froze, standing awkwardly behind him. The words stung, but it was the calmness in Charles's voice that disarmed him. Charles wasn't angry. He didn't show any sign of the outrage Greg had expected, despite the crushing error he had made. Instead, Charles's expression remained unreadable, and the silence between them felt suffocating. Charles finally turned to face Greg, his eyes steady. "I've been in your shoes," he said, his gaze piercing, almost searching. "I've worked in sales, had people treat me like I was invisible." His words weren't harsh, but they were heavy with experience, with a kind of quiet wisdom that made Greg feel even more uncomfortable. Greg stood frozen, trying to absorb what was happening. He had expected anger, perhaps even a verbal blow, but instead, Charles spoke with the kind of understanding that made Greg question his own assumptions, his own biases. Charles was right. He had judged him without cause, based solely on his appearance, on something that had nothing to do with who Charles really was. And now, standing before him, Greg realized just how wrong he had been. Charles continued, his voice softer now. "You made your judgment, but now you've learned. That's what matters." Greg felt a wave of shame wash over him, deeper than anything he had ever experienced in his career. He had been rude, dismissive. He had looked down on the wrong person. And yet here was Charles, a man who had every right to feel insulted, offering him the grace of understanding. Greg struggled to comprehend the situation. It wasn't just about the mistake he had made in dismissing a potential customer. It was about something deeper, something ingrained. A personal flaw that he hadn't realized was there. A flaw that was not just about a moment of bad judgment, but about a lifetime of unexamined assumptions. Charles looked at Greg, his gaze softening. "I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. I came here to spend my money and support your business, but I don't have time for people who can't see beyond their biases." Greg's face flushed crimson. Every word cut deeper than any reprimand could. This wasn't just about a business transaction anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and integrity. And Greg had failed at all of it. Charles paused, then offered a handshake. "I'll still buy the car, but not from you. I'll have my lawyer handle the details." Greg stood still, his arm hanging uselessly by his side as Charles walked out of the dealership. As the door closed behind him, Greg collapsed back into his chair, feeling a deep shame wash over him. But it wasn't just the shame. It was the realization that, in one moment of ignorance, he had lost far more than a potential sale. In that hour, he learned what true justice meant. not just in business, but in how he treated others. And in that silence, amidst his own self-reflection, Greg vowed never to let something like this happen again.